Englishness and Britishness matters a lot, right? And preserving that culture matters a lot. It's very easy to kind of go, well, we're all just people, and there's nothing to any of these cultural conservative inclinations. That is really easy to do, and if you do that, you solve all the intellectual problems. It's all just terrible. All this talk about culture and who we are and migration and the problems of assimilation and that sort of thing. I don't think that. I think there's something very valuable about Britishness. What Nick Fuentes did in that interview was to cross it and therefore put himself outside reasonable discourse in a way that I think he will regret as a political error. The reason why Israel exists is because of anti-Semitism, rather than the other way around. Anti-Semitism exists because of Israel. Unfortunately, my conclusion is that people's theoretical commitment to liberal democracy, the rule of law, personal freedom, individual liberty, tolerance towards other people isn't that great. Their attachment to these institutions is largely because they've worked.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Tim Shipman, the political editor of The Spectator, and I'm delighted to say I've been joined today by one of the great British political columnists, Danny Finkelstein of The Times. Lord Finkelstein, welcome.
Thanks, Tim.
And Danny, you've written this very powerful column this morning about the occasion where your kind of experience of anti-Semitism was put to Nick Fuentes, one of the clarion voices of the sort of far right in America. And you've reflected a little on that and on the Bondi Beach massacre. Just take our viewers through what your argument is and how this has affected you.
First of all, for those people who don't know who Nick Fuentes is, he's a young 27-year-old American who has become almost the de facto leader of a sort of young America First movement. He's followed by a sort of cult called the Groypers. It's very online. It's proceeds by kind of mocking and flooding people with their political commentary. He has, on occasion, for example, said that he thought Hitler was cool, that Stalin's birthday ought to be celebrated, and he was interviewed famously by Tucker Carlson. And when Tucker Carlson interviewed him, he failed to ask him a single really quite challenging question. It made Fuentes look like he was a victim because Fuentes had been cancelled by Ben Shapiro of the Daily Wire. This played into Fuentes' idea that, and I'm afraid Tucker Carlson's as well, that America is run by powerful Jews who set about cancelling good, American stock like him. And so this interview went out, and Piers Morgan challenged Nick Fuentes to come on his show where he would ask him more difficult questions. There was already a question as to whether this was a good idea, and we'll come back to that in a second. I agreed with Piers. I think he was right for reasons we can come on to. And I shared with Piers a video which he then played to Nick Fuentes, in which I talked about my parents' experience at the hands of Stalin and Hitler. Nick Fuentes had called himself part of Team Hitler, and I suggested he might rather be Team Mum, given my mother's experience, and should rather celebrate my dad's birthday rather than Stalin's. I didn't anticipate that he would do either of those things, obviously, but it was simply to make the point to the viewers of that programme: these are real people, and Hitler and Stalin were real people, and they had consequences for real people. So he played that, and of course Nick Fuentes did not, in response to Piers Morgan's questions, decide that he needed to go on an awareness course, right? He responded aggressively to this, including to my, and in fact particularly actually to my video. I suspect partly because it touched the nerve for the reasons it was supposed to. And so he had to be dismissive of that, really, otherwise the whole facade collapses. And he said, why should he care about what some old British guy had to say about me mum? He used the Dick Van Dyke way of British pronunciation. What I probably wasn't completely ready for was that this was then followed by hundreds, possibly thousands. I only don't know that it's thousands because at a point, which is quite unusual for me, I actually stopped reading them because I found them quite distressing.
This is coming to you on X, is it?
On X, yeah. And it the reason it was distressing is less what it said about me, because I think, like you, I've developed, a fairly thick skin about what people say about your columns and what you say about your politics, which is fair game because I'm also, pugnacious in things that I write. But because it was about my parents, your mum is a pair of shoes, your dad's a lampshade. There was one tweet with my dad's, which I found particularly unpleasant, with my dad's head on a lampshade. There were hundreds and hundreds of me mum died in the Holly, right? Which is something that Fuentes had said subsequently on one of his broadcasts. So then it comes back to the question of whether or not this challenge of Piers Morgan's and my own was correct. Obviously, it didn't make those people stop, and it didn't appear to have made them pause for reflection either. But I still would argue that it was correct. The reason I would argue that is Nick Fuentes has more than 1 million followers on X. His YouTubes are hugely popular, as he kind of often actually attacks his own supporters for being morons. In the background, you can hear someone going $50. Right, they're paying him. There was an excerpt in which he talked about me mum dying in the Holly in this video, and you can hear someone in the background go $20. Right, someone is paying him for saying that. He's making a lot of money out of it. It's quite successful. It won't just go away if Piers Morgan doesn't challenge it. He'd already been on Tucker Carlson. He'd been on numerous other influencer videos, and nobody had challenged him much.
And is your sense of the money thing that he's almost doing it for show, and that it is the people following him at morons, or is he genuinely of this view? And
like a lot of things, there's a combination of factors, right? So I think he probably got into it, first of all, thinking it was right. Then he realised he was pretty good at it. He's quite funny. He's got definitely a charisma. And so he was being successful and being paid to do it. Which probably beats getting a proper job. So he.
You and I both say that
correct,
as well.
Exactly. So I'm fully aware of why that would be attractive. And he then doubled up on it, and as he doubled up on it, it seems to be more successful. And he's got a cult following, which probably is satisfies his ego. But it'll be both things. Both you'll have started believing it, but also once you start doing something and it's successful, you probably believe it even more, because you wouldn't want to be feeling that he wasn't saying it. But here's a very important element of it. During some of these softer interviews, he definitely tried to play down his views. He's a bright guy, and he's probably aware he's backing himself into a corner. That though there are lots of people who are willing to support America first, there are many fewer people who are willing to support the notion that Hitler was cool. He can influence some people with that. He'll grow the number of people who think that, and that's very dangerous. But he's also cutting himself off. He's cutting himself off, say, from Tucker Carlson, so a more powerful influencer. And when he appeared on Tucker Carlson's interview, he very definitely played down, softened his view. When Piers challenged him, when I challenged him, he decided to double.
My sense is you feel that by challenging him, you did actually expose something in a way that others had not.
Look,
tell us what you think he revealed.
So, at the very least, we all need to know that this is an important strand in young American political right circles. It's significant. It's not overwhelming. It's not dominant, but it's significant. It's a significant part of the right. First of all, the America First strand, but even the Hitler strand. That is definitely part of the discourse among young Republicans. I think the Atlantic magazine had recently, one of these other, maybe it was New York magazine, had a big strand of emails from young Republicans, and they were exchanging Holocaust jokes about jokes and non-jokes about Jews. So it's definitely a strand, and we all need to know and understand that. It's something that we in this country have to challenge, and we have to also be aware it's growing. It's just part of political education, and what you and I both do a lot of the time is explain to people what's out there and what people are thinking. So it was important from that point of view to expose it, and it doesn't make it go away just to pretend it's not there.
But you also can't sort of ignore it in the way that perhaps, when there were 4 TV channels and 10 mainstream newspapers, if the BBC and the papers didn't cover this stuff, in essence, people wouldn't hear about it. That is not the case anymore.
Completely.
People are going to read and see this stuff, regardless of whether the mainstream media takes an interest in it or not.
Completely. So, it's not something that we have the power, whether we should or should not have, to exclude from the discourse, however unpleasant it is. So that's no longer a strategy you can adopt, in my opinion. So I did think taking him on was worth it. But in addition to the advantage of people knowing about it, I do think it also made him dig in a way that cuts him off from allies. So obviously, what lots of people are very carefully capable of doing is not quite saying what they really mean. And Tucker Carlson is brilliant at that. He never quite goes there, right? You listen to him and you think, well, okay, a rational person can go along with that, even though when he, for example, says, which he did to Piers Morgan, why did Britain join the war in 1939 just for Poland? Right, you can understand the strain of thought, but he's very careful about how far he takes that. He asks that question. He doesn't provide any answers to it. So I think it was very valuable and a mistake by Nick Fuentes that he went on that show. He knows that it definitely, and I think he did see it as a victory, because obviously his own cult followers thought it was great fun, and they could then follow it up, taking the mickey out of my starved to death grandmother, which they obviously enjoyed doing. But the mistake of it is that he's 27 now, will not always be 27. At some point, if he wants to build a serious and wider audience, he'll find it. He's cut himself off from that by the things that he said. He also ended up saying he thought all black people should go to jail. He said women shouldn't have the vote. That's now quite a large proportion of the American public to whom he's now beyond the pale. And I think it's worthwhile putting him in that position. So it has been a bit tough to endure. And certainly, if you'd asked Nick Fuentes, would you like Piers Morgan to put you on show? I mean, that's why he obviously went on. He definitely would have said yes. And he probably thought the same as thought he probably welcomed my video as well. And you could say, well, that shows it was a mistake. But I think actually the mistake was Nick Fuentes. But we can have, intelligent people can differ. I know that, Catherine Stott wrote a very good article in Unheard where she argued it, Piers Morgan wasn't successful. And she's clearly baffled by my saying it was the right thing to do. But I don't think she's right.
So, look, there's a couple of points here. There's the whole issue of, this sort of online right. You look at Donald Trump, some of what he does is quite interesting. A lot of how he does it is very politically sophisticated. But underneath it, there is this sort of cesspool of views. A lot of it comes with, it's quite difficult to separate the kind of political impetus from the views sometimes. And, arguably you and I would spend our time trying to analyse what Trump's doing and why it's successful rather than endorsing it. For some people, the two come together and it's quite difficult to sort of separate them. And it's difficult to get to grips with these sort of populist leaders who often find that political traction comes with the most extreme position. Are we almost sort of kind of making it easy for them by saying, well, look, Trump's quite clever, actually, rather than saying, actually, this is all deplorable. But I feel like the stage where everybody just said this is deplorable, that didn't really work very well for anybody.
Well, there are two things. First of all, it's really, really important as a political analyst to try to take yourself out of it and look at what the electorate's thinking and try to understand how, big things are changing, like the ability to communicate over the media, or the difference that Trump makes as a figure who shows people how politics can be disrupted successfully, and how people look at that and think, okay, well, that's what disruption means. And that
feels like everybody wants to be a disruptor.
Yeah,
now.
So it's very important to as a political analyst not to say, well, because I don't like that, it doesn't work, because that's not the same thing at all. I've got to struggle with that with Nick Fuentes, which is accepting that there's actually an audience for that and it's successful with some people, and seeing what's good about, what's clever and working about what he does, whilst also thinking it's monumentally dangerous and reprehensible. The other thing which is interesting, so that's as a political analyst. The more tricky one is actually as a conservative. So as a conservative, I believe that Englishness and Britishness matters a lot, right? And preserving that culture matters a lot. I'm by no means, it's very easy to kind of go, well, we're all just people, and there's nothing to any of these cultural conservative inclinations. That is really easy to do. And if you do that, you solve all the intellectual problems. It's all just terrible. All this talk about culture and who we are and migration and the problems of assimilation and that sort of thing. I don't think that. I think there's something very valuable about Britishness, and I think it's one of the things that's preserved and helped my parents. So then you've got to try to explain to people the difference between that and the sort of nativism of Nick Fuentes. You've got to say, yes, sovereignty matters, yes, cultural coherence, that phrase that Katie Lamb used that she was so attacked, that also matters. But at the same time, you've got to have the ability for other people to live in the country and to be tolerated and to feel they can be full citizens, and to have a liberal atmosphere of love of each other. Trying to make people understand how you balance those things and have them together, that is quite a hard argument. So those arguments I found more difficult to land, particularly on things like social media, where it's very difficult to express yourself with any degree of subtlety.
Yeah, you've got to hope everyone reads the whole thread rather than a couple of tweets. To broaden this out, there seems to be a very virulent anti-Semitic streak in general to a lot of this stuff that's going on with the online right. And then Bondi happens, and you've got the strain of Islamist thought, which has been specifically a problem, particularly since 9/11. But it's almost as if other parts of the sort of body politic are giving space in which, Islamism felt like a more discrete problem, and now it feels to me like sort of widespread anti-Semitism has made that more of a sort of, the pond is wider almost.
Yeah, look, partly it's because there's such a danger to any philosophy that believes that kind of racial or ethnic superiority should dominate, that leads to one group should dominate the discourse and be in charge of the institutions of the state. And I think that is profoundly dangerous. It's not, and it's different from what I talked about earlier, from having a sort of clear tradition and culture. That is a different thing, and it is extremely dangerous. And Jews, because we're almost always the minority in every place that we live, because there aren't very many Jews in the world. Jews have been always the particular victim of this, and there's a sort of feeling that somehow the superiority of Islam, or in Nick Fuentes' case, nativist Americans, is being suppressed by some minority group that has got hold of the elite and is suppressing the majority instincts. And Jews are often the target of that. So it's a particular way of looking at the world, which actually Nick Fuentes shares with the Islamists. However, I mean, I was talking to a friend about this over the weekend. At the moment, the Islamists are more likely to be the ones with the guns, at least in this country. Right? And if you lived in the United States, you might feel a bit differently to that because of the widespread use of firearms, but so it's a particularly urgent problem, the fact that they have now begun to put Jews even more to the centre of their kind of absolutism, partly because of what's happened in the Middle East. But the really important thing is some people say, well, and I've had a few emails extraordinarily in response to what I've written about this. Extraordinary, you get a few emails saying basically if the Jews hadn't been so bad in Israel, this wouldn't have happened. Well, the first thing is we know that's not true because it did happen, right? It happened before the existence of the State of Israel. Everything that happened to my parents, all of that happened before the existence of the State of Israel. And by the way, there was a strong support in the Middle East by lots of factions and ideologies for that kind of action against the Jews. So we know it's not true that it's just caused by that. But secondly, the opposite is actually true. The reason why Israel exists is because of anti-Semitism, rather than the other way around. Anti-Semitism exists because of Israel. And we can all have an argument about what Israel is doing, but October the 7th happened before that. It was a response to October the 7th. So it's simply not the case that these... I think we'd all agree that something that happened on Bon Beach isn't justified by what Israel has done. But more than that, it's not caused by it.
Yeah. So what do we do about this, bluntly? About both aspects of it? About the anti-Semitism. I mean, I think you write intelligently in this column about how, the reason you're having a row to a degree about Hitler and Stalin is because a lot of people have no knowledge of this stuff anymore. It's becoming a folk memory. You make the point that, a lot of survivors are no longer with us now and very few remain. And when you've lost that kind of immediacy, the kind of human testimony, how do we deal with that? And then separately, how do we deal with Islam? And we've just had Prime Minister's questions. Kemi Badenoch said, it's not good enough to criticise. We need to expunge Islamism from Britain. That sounds to me quite an optimistic political prognostication. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about the broader issue and about dealing with Islamism in particular.
Look, first thing is just because there's a problem doesn't mean there's necessarily a solution. But I would start with this. My grandfather came back from the First World War and in 1919 he started to warn that there were going to be pogroms against Jews. Said that if we don't do something, we'll talk to our descendants of death and destruction. And of course, I was reading that thinking, well, that's exactly what then did happen. And he spends his whole life between, it's in fact his whole life actually, but particularly between 1919 and 1940, warning that this was about to happen. And none of his warnings make any difference at all. And so you have to look at that and think, well, that's quite depressing. But then when you look at the political rise of Hitler, you can see that the crucial events in it were, first of all, the mass inflation, that's led to the kind of the First World War, actually, to begin with, and what it did to German politics, then the mass inflation, but finally and crucially, the Great Depression. And this takes the Nazi Party from being a small group with, which was sometimes scoring 2.5% in elections, to scoring nearer 40%. And then obviously being able to form a government and being the largest party in the Reichstag. And the message of that, I think, is that making a success of the alternative is critical. Unfortunately, my conclusion is that people's theoretical commitment to liberal democracy, the rule of law, personal freedom, individual liberty, tolerance towards other people isn't that great. Their attachment to these institutions is largely because they've worked. Yeah. People have become wealthier, people have become happier, people have become safer, and because they've worked, we tend to cooperate with each other to extend it.
I mean, people say we're 3 meals from a revolution the whole time, and there's an element of we're 2 decades of suppressed wage growth from huge discontent.
It's perfect. So I think one of the things we need to do is avoid on top of this long period of suppressed wage growth, having any major crises of the kind that happened in 2008 actually, but also obviously in the late 1920s and 30s and early 30s. But second, it is about trying to make sure that these liberal democratic institutions and capitalism work for everyone. And although that might seem like a diversion from the philosophy of Islamism and whether prevent works and all those things, I think it's actually more important than that. However, we need to do those things too. So one of the reasons I took on Nick Fuentes is because you can't ignore what's in front of your eyes. And in front of our eyes, people are walking down big British streets with a huge sign saying "Globalise the Intifada," which is let's actually make sure we kill Jews everywhere, not just in Israel. And the people are looking at that and thinking, I'm sure they don't really mean it, or maybe there's another way we could interpret that. And that really isn't. Those are very dangerous sentiments. Not all of them. So people need to be able to say things that are infuriating and where people think the social consequences would be bad. But when people are actually saying let's wage a holy war, or saying let's globalise the violence we've seen elsewhere, we need to think, well, they mean what they're actually saying. Otherwise they could put it differently, right? You don't actually have to say globalise the Intifada. You could say, you don't even need to use the Intifada. You could even say, let's support the political resistance, or whatever you use it. You could make it clear that they don't mean international murder, and they don't make it clear for the reason that it's particularly provocative to put it that way. But it's not just the opponents it provokes, it's also the supporters. And you can't look at these people and what they do and think they weren't talked into it by some people. So that
it feels like this moment has created a sort of toxic combination. Some of those people will be people who've come to Britain with perhaps a different kind of cultural outlook, who are, politically Islamist. Some of them will be people who've had a terrible time since 2008 and are looking for someone to blame. And some of them, bluntly, are a bunch of posh middle-class kids running around who think it's terribly fashionable to whack a keffir on their head and hold up a poster.
Sure. So this is there's a really important, interesting strand of which I've noticed on social media in my own exchanges, and that is people who, when I'm writing about some of these things, kind of blame me for the fact that these people are there. Now, I've actually been a long-standing opponent of mass migration, and I warned what the consequences would be. I first was doing that while I worked for William Hague, for which we got into a lot of political hot water. And then when I started writing...
Hague's policy now would be sort of regarded as milquetoast way off to the left, completely unpalatable even to the Labour Party.
When we started talking about those things, it was regarded as really awful that we were talking about them. And I remember, The Independent had a cartoon with William Hague's face on the front of the train going to Auschwitz. I had to write to them about how offensive I found that. But in 2004, when I was writing for the Times, my early columns, one of them was about the dangers of mass migration, the fact that people hadn't voted for it, the consequences it might have. Despite the fact that I've done that, and I've reminded people, more recently that I've done that, I often get people saying it's due to your liberalism. Now, that we're having this problem. And there are two reasons why they think that. One is probably just a generic ascribing to someone who's thought to be who is in fact a liberal Tory and who's more thought of as more of a centrist Tory, any problems that might exist, and so therefore I must have been in favour of them.
Well, and a mainstream media commentator as well.
I'm less bothered by that error, but I'm afraid I think the other reason is because I'm Jewish, and there is a kind of a blaming by some forces on the right. Nick Fuentes is an example of that, of the problems they have with radical Islam on Jewish liberalism. And so we get we end up getting both of these elements. And I notice that is quite a strong strand in response to the things that I say. And I kind of find it almost more disturbing than some of the more extreme Palestinian rhetoric, which at least concerns itself with political positions that are adjacent to ones that I've taken.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about the British culture. Is there given that a lot of this stuff that we're now seeing and witnessing is coming from America, is there a particularly British way that we could be dealing with this, do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, I think the problem is less serious here. And partly it's just because we haven't had Britain, for geographical reasons, and if you take a historical or indeed coldly practical view of our military might, we're not in a position to run a merely Britain first international policy. So therefore, you then don't get into the idea of whose wars are we fighting and why are we being subverted into doing it. Has not become part of the right political view, which it always has been in the US. So in the US, in some ways, they are regressing back to the position of in 1939. Henry Ford, one of the great sponsors of international anti-Semitism, the promoter of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and many myths about Jews, which originated with his Dearborn Independent and his own anti-Semitism. Henry Ford, even after he had settled his libel cases against and then withdrawn from this active anti-Semitism, was still saying that he thought the Jews had caused the Second World War, that America was fighting that. That wasn't much part of mainstream British discourse in the way that it was in the US. So we have got a different tradition, and I absolutely therefore feel safer in this country, even though we've got a smaller Jewish community, than I think I would do living in the United States at this moment, because that tradition does not exist. So first of all, I think we can approach this by saying it's not legitimately a British position, this nativism. We've never been like that. We're much more... and so we can reject that from a much more sort of self-confident view that hasn't got that tradition in this country. But it's still a big problem. It's as well, I'm not sure that I've got every kind of solution to it.
You must be waiting for the May elections with a little trepidation as well to see how widespread the sort of sectarian voting seems to be in some of those.
Look, I think it's a wholly different thing. So interestingly, my view of Nigel Farage is that the crucial moment in his political career was his decision to expel Buster Mottram, the tennis player, when he came to the UKIP national executive and proposed a relationship with the BNP at a moment when that made electoral sense for UKIP. But Nigel Farage could see that association was the end. And he has always been, both by political instinct and by political strategy, completely opposed to letting his right-wing populist movement become a far-right movement. Yep. I think Rupert Lowe has a different view about the positioning, and Ben Habib has a different view of the positioning of reform and the positioning of the right parties, and that is the origin of their dispute, much of which is often ascribed to Farage being touchy, and I'm sure that you're much more the expert on this than I am, so I'm sure you'd know more about that. But it seems to me that there's a political element to what's also personal, obviously.
I mean, Farage's argument is always that he is the person who has kept the far right out of sort of the centre of British politics. But we see on the other side, with these sort of Gaza independents who seem like they're going to do well in May, that, in bits of Birmingham and Blackburn and places like that, we could see quite a few of those elected.
I think it's calamitous that we're in a position where a big city like Birmingham should be dominated by that kind of politics. And how on earth we let that happen when it was obviously that it was going to happen, and it's a calamity. And what happened with the Maccabi Tel Aviv football match, that was the fact that it's like proving even now quite difficult to unpick exactly what the police did or didn't do. One of the reasons for that is that it's become so much a part of the institutional politics, policing, and sort of infrastructure of Birmingham. They can't even distinguish anymore when it's obvious to me what they've done is to exclude the Israeli team for reasons that are related to the sectarian political ideology of the local community there, and that's a disaster.
Didn't feel like that was a British institution doing terribly well with a complicated problem.
But I mean, it's obviously they're obviously coping with the local environment that they've got and the people that and the MPs that they've got. So anyway, it's obviously a pretty serious issue we've got. I'm not sure I know entirely how to respond to that. And one of the things you see is people who are merely angry about it imply that the solution to that is really easy, but it isn't.
No.
We've created a society. We have to live in the society we've created, and we need to do what we can to try to bring people together and be part of a single people, and not to see things in sectarian terms. And you can't wish that problem away. You have to approach it.
I think I agree with you, though, that the way to drain all these swamps is to have successful government that spreads prosperity to the people. And I mean, I've spent, not quite as long as you, but years and years writing about pretty ineffectual governments that have failed to do precisely that. And it doesn't look really like this one is going to do any better.
It's so disappointing. And I didn't want. I was used to say to friends, for all that the Tory government was failing by that point, if you elect the Labour Party, Labour's going to get in, and that is what's happened. They ran in the election. I satirised it as Britain's completely broken. Let's do nothing about it. And the result was they got elected and they don't know what to do. And that's been a calamitous failure, which has produced. All the energy has gone to lots of fringe groupings. And so yes, I worry about the elections for that reason. I don't think that's good for the British political system. But I'm extremely cautious and care about ever accusing people of, kind of racism or being part of the far right, unless they've done things that personally merit that designation. The thing about because there needs to be a line, and what Nick Fuentes did in that interview was to cross it and therefore put himself outside reasonable discourse in a way that I think he will regret as a political error.
Well, Danny, thank you very much indeed for your time today, and thank you very much for listening. These are pretty thorny issues, and I fear we'll be back discussing them again sometime soon. But thanks very much for listening in, and we'll see you soon.